And as we move into our next sub-lesson on configuring group policy processing, we're going to look at configuring behavior of some unique situations when GPOs are applied. The first one we're going to begin with is called GPO loopback processing. And this is normally applicable when you have a situation where you have certain computers that you want to have a standard desktop, regardless of who logs in. This could be like a kiosk machines. So when someone logs into that computer, we want to ignore the user's normal desktop settings. Remember, those are stored under the user configuration, where on a kiosk, we may want to have settings configured based on the AD computer location. Now, when looking at loopback processing, we can configure two options. Replace, which replaces the user's list of GPOs with the list of GPOs obtained during the computer startup. So none of the user's GPOs get applied. The merge is a little bit more friendly. It will append the user configuration node settings from the GPO list for the computer to the list of the GPO settings applied during the user login. So we're using a combination of the two GPOs. After configuring the loopback processing, it may require that you restart the computer in order for the configuration to take effect. Another time that we want to configure how GPOs are processed are when we have a slow link. This is called slow link detection, and we can configure what happens to GPOs if it occurs. First off, in order for us to use slow link detection, we have to have enabled this option, and it has to detect that the DC response is slower than 500 kilobits per second. If both of those criteria are met, then the GPOs are processed differently. In fact, if that criteria is met, there are several client-side extensions that are simply disabled. They don't want them to even execute because of the connection between the client and the DC. And those are the IE maintenance, software installation policy. You certainly don't want to install software in a slow link connection. Folder redirection, running scripts, IPsec policies, wireless policies, as well as disk quota policies. All of those will be automatically disabled if they detect a slow link. While we're talking about client-side extension, remember this is a DLL that's going to implement the group policy on the client computer. And to do so, it uses a service called Group Policy Client to process those GPOs. However, the client has to connect to the domain controller in order to request and apply the GPOs. If you want to see what client extensions you have on your computer, you can actually go into this registry key here. And if you want to control what client-side extensions are applied, even when a slow link is detected, you can do so by configuring the policy called Configure Security Policy Processing. Now, more on slow link detection. You can also enable caching, and when caching is enabled and a client detects a slow link, a cached version of the GPOs are going to be applied by the client-side extensions. And to determine whether or not it's considered a slow link detection, we have two values that it's going to take into consideration. The first is slow link value. The default is 500 milliseconds. If there's no response from the DC within 500 milliseconds, that's issue A. Issue B is a timeout value, which has a 5,000 millisecond default. It's going to assume after that point in time that there's no connection, and it will at that point use the cached client-side extensions if you've enabled caching. After making a change to a GPO, you're most likely going to want to test the effect of those changes. If you get paid by the hour, you could wait about 90 minutes with a 30-minute offset because that's the default refresh rate. Or if it's a computer GPO setting, you could restart the computer. Or if it's a user GPO setting, you could log off and log back in. But to me, none of those sound any good. So let's do this. Let's use a command line utility called gpupdate.exe/force. That'll immediately refresh my GPOs. But better than that, because PowerShell rocks, you can actually use a PowerShell commandlet called invoke-gpupdate. That will also refresh your group policies. Let's take a jump back out to our live image and explore some of these GPO behaviors we've just discussed. We are back in GPMC. We're going to again expand on our domain, and we're going to see in here we have our group policy objects. We'll go into there. We'll pick on our MTP good stuff, and we're going to right click on that and click edit. So we're going to go into the GPME. We're going to go into computer configuration, into policies, into administrative templates. We have more on this coming up in the next lesson. We're going to go into system in here. And then we have a group policy folder of group policies. So we're going to double click on that. And let's look at a few that we talked about. Here's where I would come in and configure security policy processing. I can come in here and enable this. And I can specify if I don't want to apply during periodic background processing or process even if the group policy objects have not changed. So that way it updates every time. Remember, GPOs only update if there have been changes, but with security, maybe we want to make sure they're always updated. So that's one setting I could configure in here. I could also scroll down and take a look at a couple other things that we talked about here. Enable group policy caching. Remember, we just talked about caching. I can come in here and enable this, and I can specify the timeout values. Remember I said 500 and 5,000? We can modify those timeout values after I enable the group policy caching. We'll go ahead and set that back, and here's our slow link detection that we just discussed. Again, this one's off, and we can enable this. After doing so, we can specify the connection speed here as well. So this is where I would manage the behavior of GPOs, whether it would be forcing a policy to be applied, caching policies, or configuring a slow link detection.